Hello world of YouTube, and welcome to the second week of Decade and List Week 2010s edition. The Music Week, the one that I know a lot of you, more than probably anybody else, have been looking forward to. And this week I'm going to be breaking down my least favorite and favorite albums of the 2010s with a little movie-related list in the middle to kind of break up the topics a bit that are discussed this week. I'm going to be doing my favorite movie scenes of the decade on Wednesday. But today, because, you can't talk about one without the other, I'm going to be talking about my least favorite records to come out in the past decade. Now, like my worst games, I'm not going to be doing like a big write-up of the worst of the decade, even though I probably could, because I listened to some pretty shitty records this decade. Instead, I'm going to be just breaking down my 11 least favorite albums I checked out over the last 10 years. Now, you'll notice, out of the years that that ended up on this list as far as like what representation has across the decade, while there's some stuff that came out earlier in the decade on here, a lot of it is from the back half of the decade. That's because, well, I feel like there were some bad albums that came out in the beginning of the decade by acts that are known to be bad. And there's some representation of what a lot of artists were doing in the back half of the decade. A lot of the back half of the decade had acts that were either chasing relevancy or well past their point of prominence and started making some really bad decisions musically that ended up resulting in their worst records they have ever done. And that is going to be a big part of this list. Because, again, there was some really bad stuff that I listened to that came out earlier in the decade, but the back half of the decade, while it had some great shit, it also had some really abhorrent material that I'm more than happy to break down for you guys today. Now let's go ahead and dive on in. This album was thrown at me when I was a part of the Mad Sounds podcast with Mark, and man, I still wonder why to this day he decided to just pull this up and throw it at me, because I've never been a Train fan. I think Drops of Jupiter's fine, but they're not a band that I would say is great, and I really don't like Pat Monahan's writing. I feel like while I love weird songwriters, he is like the wrong kind of weird. And on A Girl, a Bottle, a Boat, he decides to not only continue that trend of his really obtuse songwriting, he also him and the band pull together some of the most flaccid, boring, data-rific songs that belong behind the most bland of Corona commercials. This is just the shittiest form of this type of rock that you could ever be exposed to. It's really more pop than rock, but you get what I mean. And I really hate that I was exposed to this. Not as much as some of the records that were thrown my way, but man, do I not like A Girl, a Bottle, a Boat, because it is an album that I immediately left a really shitty taste in my mouth upon being exposed to it initially. And when I was pulling this together and I realized that, oh yeah, that was a thing. Lil Wayne made some weird moves over the last decade, and the weirdest, arguably, was his dippings into rock music on Rebirth, while other rappers also dipped their toes into non-rap this decade, something that I'll be talking about pretty soon. This is so bad. It's one of the worst. The guitar playing is flaccid. The production doesn't match. And a lot of the songs are just poorly written. I know I used to fuck with Drop the World back when this album came out because, we all make bad mistakes in life. And while this seemingly was my backdoor gateway into Mayday, because they were his band for some of the videos on here, I still don't like this record. And while you won't see Cuddy's Speeding Bullet to Heaven on here for its own reasons, Rebirth is probably worse than it, if only because, while Cuddy had some passion behind that project, even if it didn't turn out the best, Rebirth just feels like a misguided attempt at trying to do something. I don't know what that something is, but it ain't it, Chief.
This world is so beautiful, but then again...
Like I said, rappers were doing weird shit this decade, and Logic, seemingly out of ideas in the rap world, decided, I'm going to make an indie pop record and make it the soundtrack to my book. Which, again, conceptually, I think that's a cool idea, making a soundtrack to your book. But this really ain't it. Like, the production on here is so carbon copy for a lot of stuff that's popular in certain aspects of the indie scene. Logic doesn't fit this glove at all. And the lyrics, while, again, giving you nice images of, potential Stephen King influence, it just doesn't pan out in any meaningful way. And he dips into some avenues that do not cohesively fit. It's not a good project, not worth your time, and hopefully is a point of clarity for Logic following the reception of this record that maybe he should take a break and just chill out for a bit, man.
Taps when I dissed you like it was fun. Actually used to run back to the...
While I've been pretty harsh on Eminem's last couple of records, this is the point where it kind of reached an apex for me. This is Eminem at his most bogged down production-wise. The production on here is just a mess, and his flow is so sloppy, and his writing is its worst, and the features are baffling. Like, he used X Ambassadors well past their expiration date on here, and the topics just don't suit him well. This is just a rough listen all across the board. Like, I know there's defenders for Kamikaze and Music to be Murdered By, but this is, I feel like, across the board regarded as his worst project. It's the point where a lot of his tropes he was leaning on over the last couple of records kind of fell apart big time, and his overabundance of use of pop tropes just didn't suit him well. It's a record that leaves a bitter taste in your mouth, and it's one of the longer experiences in Eminem's catalog too. So it's just an experience that goes on for too long that shouldn't have sounded like this to begin with.
You turning the tables when you dance on the table, trying to talk and
You happy, Scott? I'm sure you are, because you're a sadistic fuck. An album with the worst type of trendy production, with an artist that seemingly doesn't know what he wants to present, and is both trying to recapture any sense of youth he had while trying to reflect at the same time the life he's lived. It is not a great record by any stretch of the imagination. The album is also just really hard to take seriously when the album really tries to pull it back and get sincere because of how rough this production really sounds. And it hit me just now, it sounds like a really bad Justin Bieber record, which that's hard to top as far as, like, meeting that bar of mediocrity and surpassing it. And while there have been other artists trying to really capture their youth in a sad way, this might be one of the saddest. But it's hard when I'm so run down and you're so... Korn's dips into dubstep just don't work. Like, yeah, sure, they might have sounded like they made sense on paper, because Korn are all about big chugga riffs, and, dubstep is big wubby production. But the marriage of the two is just a bad one. It is one of obnoxious sounds with a clashing of styles that it's like wearing plaid over stripes. It just is obnoxious and gaudy and the worst kind of collaboration you could expect. I don't even think EDM fans like this because it's too basic, and nu metal fans don't like it because it's too cluttered. It's not pleasing anybody, even though you may think it might work on paper. It's just a recipe for disaster.
through the dark days, but you don't know how.
It's hard to talk about music of the last decade without mentioning the impact Imagine Dragons have had on it. Countless acts chased the trends that they set forth in the alternative rock realm, and they seemingly changed what it means to be alternative rock forever. Not in a good way. And Papa Roach's Who Do You Trust is, I would argue, the worst type of trend chasing. You know, while bands like Bullet for My Valentine and 30 Seconds to Mars and a slew of other bands tried to capture the same magic that Imagine Dragons do, they just seemingly whimper out a record that is too soft to be as impactful as the ballads Imagine Dragons pen, and doesn't have the same oomph that those records do, the records that they make do. And it's weird for Papa Roach to wear this kind of skin, because when they first came out, they were kind of amidst a trend themselves, but they at least adapted into a way that felt a little more cohesive, and this was just a step too far. You know, it's a song that doesn't leave you with much of anything, and that's probably as apt of a description as anyone could ever give this record.
'Cause you're the last of a dying breed. Run our names in the wet concrete.
Fall Out Boy's return kept getting worse and worse as the decade went on, with them leaning more and more on pop tropes, and Mania was just the apex of that, with obnoxious production choices, terrible hooks, and really nothing that sounded like the band that they at least started the decade off sounding like. This is an album where I'm glad side projects exist, because like I said in my original review, I felt bad for Andy and Joe, because they just kind of felt like they were sidelined this entire project. While American Beauty, American Psycho at least had some fun hooks, and the production, while super thick, kind of fit some of the sounds they were toying with. This is, like I said, for a couple of artists, just a step too far in the worst direction. Really not a fun sit through, and again, I hope that this makes them sit back and reflect and see where they should really go next, because the reception for this record wasn't the best.
Got a question for you. Can I get an answer?
This is an album that for a time my channel was kind of tied to, sadly, because I sat down and did a live stream roasting this project, but it is definitely the worst thing I've ever heard Chris Brown do. I never listened to the follow-up because I spent enough time with Chris Brown on Heartbreak on a Full Moon, and I tore apart this fucking record. I think a lot of the writing is very hypocritical. Some of the production ideas are outright derivative of other artists, and it is not worth your time at all. It is a hard sit-through, and out of a decade full of long experiences, something else I'll be talking about in just a few seconds, this is one of the worst by an artist that should have floundered out into obscurity years ago. The singing isn't good, the production isn't good, a lot of the production is obnoxious, and I don't enjoy it. This album really is that bad, guys. Corey Feldman's Angelic to the Core is a rough listen. Overwrought ideas that go on for just too long, features that seem really misplaced, and production that is some of the worst I've heard in the decade. This is a slog, but it's one that I made, and it's one that I gotta talk about one last time. A lot of the skits are tacky. A lot of this album is tacky. It's like a dad who, big in the 70s, and is trying to really spice it up to show the world that he's still got it. You know, he squeezes into his pants that don't fit anymore and stomps around like he's, you know, happy with himself. But I don't like this record. A lot of the production is cheap in ways that I feel like you could just go past if you just sit down and think about what you're doing. And I don't feel like he did that. Yeah, it really is probably the worst thing I've heard over the last decade. Doug Walker's The Wall is everything wrong with parody music, everything wrong with music analysis, everything wrong with film analysis is put on full display on this project. And like I said in my review, The Wall is not my favorite great Pink Floyd record, but it's still not bad enough to make a whole record that tries to both be a critique of it and Doug Walker's own issues with the current landscape of social media, and other attempts at trying to do commentary in an album of critiquing. It's an album that lacks focus. When the title itself should be all the focus you need, Doug decides to throw that out the window and just make whatever the hell he wants by the end of this project, both in the album and in the video proper. They both delve into their own madness in a way that isn't needed, you know. And it's the type of internet thing that happened a lot over the last decade. Smosh made an album. I don't know if you knew that. Smosh made an album. And this is the worst of that, if only because not only does it tap into that type of stuff, it tries to be smart. And it fails at that as well. And that's why I'd argue it's the worst album I heard over the last decade. And that was it. What'd you think of these albums? Do you agree? Is there an album you hate more than these? Let me know in those comments down below. Like I said, tomorrow is going to be my favorite movie scenes of the last decade. But until then, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general notary content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons. If you would like to join their ranks, linked in the description is my Patreon. I've been Val Rack. You guys have videos, lots of situations, and I'll see you another day.